This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome to this exploration of Maori controversy in Aotearoa, New Zealand. In this narration, we'll examine the complex and often contentious issues surrounding Indigenous rights, sovereignty, and cultural preservation. From historical treaty disputes to contemporary debates over land, language, and representation, these controversies reveal deep questions about identity, justice, and what it means to honor the past while building an inclusive future. Join us as we navigate these challenging conversations with respect and curiosity, seeking to understand multiple perspectives on matters that continue to shape New Zealand's society today. Chapter 1. The Shadow and the Substance. On the evening of January 30th, 1840, printer William Colenso finished the last of 100 invitations. He had been in New Zealand for 6 years and 1 month, and now he was helping to summon Northland chiefs to meet a man who had just arrived from Sydney with a very particular mission. The invitations asked the chiefs to come to the house of Mr. and Mrs. Busby on February 5th to meet Rangatira Hobson, the chief of the Queen, who would be a governor for everyone. The weather that week started showery, but cleared by Wednesday. Thursday, February 6, 1840, was one of those perfect summer days that make you believe the warmth will never end. Even the cicadas, Colenso wrote, sang livelier than usual. Everything wore an appearance of cheerfulness and activity. On the hill at the Busby's house, sailors had rigged a huge tent. Down on the beach and out in the bay, the foreshore was thick with canoes, and the sea dotted with anchored ships. Chiefs and traders, missionaries and settlers, policemen from Sydney who had arrived with William Hobson aboard the Herald, and even that French priest Pompallier, whom the Anglicans and Methodists distrusted, everyone had turned up to see what would happen. It felt like a big picnic. People walking up the hill could buy their lunches at takeaway stalls beside the track: bread and roast pork, beer, rum, and brandy. Mr. Busby was being a bountiful host with 30 pigs, 5 tons of potatoes, and half a ton of flour for the visiting chiefs, plus gifts of tobacco they could smoke while listening to Hobson's proposal. The treaty had been prepared in just 3 days. Hobson had been forced to write it himself with help from his secretary James Freeman and British resident James Busby, none of whom was a lawyer. The Colonial Office had given Hobson no draft to work from. His instructions from Lord Normanby were clear enough in their intent: achieve a voluntary transfer of sovereignty over all or part of New Zealand, assume control over land matters, and establish civil government. What Normanby had not specified was how to accomplish this through a document that would satisfy both the British Crown and hundreds of independent Maori chiefs who had already declared their own sovereignty 5 years earlier. In 1835, 34 northern chiefs had signed He Whakaputanga, a declaration of independence that proclaimed themselves the United Tribes of New Zealand and declared their absolute independence. The declaration had later been expanded to 52 signatories. The Colonial Office had initially acknowledged this independence, but by 1840 policy had shifted. Internal documents reveal the Crown's thinking had moved from planning a Maori New Zealand to envisioning a settler New Zealand, where British authority would be supreme. On the evening of February 4th, just 2 days before the planned signing, Hobson made a crucial decision. He asked the head of the Church Missionary Society mission, Reverend Henry Williams, and William's son Edward Marsh Williams, to translate the entire English document into Maori overnight. Henry Williams had his own reasons for agreeing. He was concerned about the actions of the New Zealand Company in Wellington, and felt he had to cooperate with Hobson to ensure the treaty would be as favorable as possible to Maori. Working through the night, Williams avoided using any English words that had no expression in Maori. When he delivered the translation the next morning, he would later certify it as literal a translation of the Treaty of Waitangi as the idiom of the language will allow. James Busby had also contributed to the translation choices, proposing Wakamenga instead of Huihunga when describing the confederation of chiefs in the preamble. But what constitutes the literal translation when the concepts themselves don't translate? The Maori language in 1840 had only recently been given written form by the missionaries themselves. Many abstract European political concepts simply had no Maori equivalents. The most consequential choice involved the word sovereignty itself. The English version stated clearly that the Maori chiefs cede to Her Majesty the Queen of England absolutely and without reservation all the rights and powers of sovereignty. In English legal and political terms, this was unambiguous. Sovereignty meant complete supreme authority, the power to make laws, levy taxes, wage war, and control all aspects of governance. Williams chose the word kawanatanga. This was not a traditional Maori word at all. It was a neologism based on kawana, the Maori rendering of governor, which in turn came from the English word. Williams had previously used kawanatanga when translating He Wakaputanga in 1835, where it appeared alongside mana and kingitanga to describe different forms of authority. To Maori in 1840, kawanatanga suggested the kind of administrative authority a governor might exercise, perhaps managing British settlers, maintaining order, organizing trade. It did not convey the transfer of supreme political power that sovereignty meant in English. The Maori word that could have captured sovereignty more clearly was mana, but Williams did not use it. Some scholars, including Ruth Ross, have argued that mana would have more accurately conveyed the transfer of supreme authority the English text describes. Other scholars, like Judith Binney, counter that mana would never have been the right word, because in Maori understanding, no one can give up their mana. It is inherent, earned, demonstrated, not something transferable through a signature. Article 2 diverged even more dramatically. The English text stated, Her Majesty the Queen of England confirms and guarantees to the chiefs and tribes of New Zealand and to the respective families and individuals thereof the full, exclusive, and undisturbed possession of their lands and estates, forests, fisheries, and other properties which they may collectively or individually possess. This was the language of property ownership, possession of lands and estates, and other properties. To a British legal mind, this was clear. The Maori would own their property as subjects of the Crown. Possession is what a subject has. Sovereignty is what a ruler wields. The Maori text guaranteed to Maori te tino rangatiratanga over their lands, villages, and all their treasures. Rangatiratanga literally means chieftainship, but it encompasses much more: authority, mana, the right to make decisions and exercise control. Tino intensifies it, full, complete, absolute. So te tino rangatiratanga means absolute chieftainship, full authority. To many modern Maori scholars, it means sovereignty itself, the very thing the English version said was being ceded. Other discrepancies created additional confusion. The treaty's preemption clause, which said only the Crown could purchase Maori land, was poorly translated. The Maori word used was hokonga, which simply meant to buy, sell, or trade. There was no sense of the Crown's exclusive right embedded in the word itself. Many Maori believed they were simply giving the Queen first offer on land, after which they could sell to anyone. Even the identity of the treaty partner was unclear. Throughout the Maori text, the word used is Ingarani, meaning England alone. The English version refers to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. Were the Maori making an agreement with a queen who would honor her promises, or being absorbed into an imperial system? Henry Williams himself encouraged a particular understanding when he spoke to the chiefs on the morning of February 5th. He told them the treaty was Queen Victoria's act of love to you. She wants to ensure you that you keep what is yours, your property, your rights and privileges, and those things you value. He warned them about the possibility of French intervention and told them the treaty is really like a fortress to you. The chiefs debated for 5 hours. Much of the debate was recorded by William Colenso. Some chiefs were skeptical. Rewa, a Catholic chief influenced by French Bishop Pompallier, said bluntly, "The Maori people don't want a governor. We aren't European. It's true that we've sold some of our lands, but this country is still ours. We chiefs govern this land of our ancestors." But Protestant chiefs who trusted the missionaries were more accepting. Hīkoi told Hobson, "Governor, you should stay with us and be like a father. If you go away, then the French or the rum sellers will take us Maori over." Tamati Wakanene pointed out the practical reality. "Some of you tell Hobson to go, but that's not going to solve our difficulties. We have already sold so much land here in the north. We have no way of controlling the Europeans who have settled on it." From Maori chiefs, signing required enormous trust. They were trusting the missionaries who had taught them to read, who had brought them Christianity, who they believed had their interests at heart. But Maori culture in 1840 was predominantly oral. Writing was a recent introduction. Of the approximately 530 to 540 chiefs who eventually signed the treaty, only 39 signed the English version. Only 12 signed their names in the Latin alphabet on the Maori version. Most conveyed their identity by drawing parts of their moko, their personal facial tattoos. Others marked the document with an X. For an oral culture, what matters most is not what is written, but what is said, what is heard, what is witnessed in the speaking. The authority comes from the speaker's mana, from the solemnity of the occasion, from the public nature of the commitment. The piece of paper is just a record. The real agreement is in the words that were spoken and heard. This meant that when Maori chiefs heard Williams explain the treaty as protecting their property and rights and privileges and treasures, when they heard it described as an act of love and a fortress for their protection, when they heard that they would retain their chieftainship while gaining the Queen's protection, that is what they understood the treaty to mean. A northern chief named Nopera Panakareo captured this understanding in a phrase that became famous. "Ko te atarao o te wenua ai riro I a te Queenie, ko te tinana o te wenua ai waiho kinga Maori." The shadow of the land will go to the Queen, but the substance of the land will remain with us. The shadow and the substance. It was a poetic way of describing what seemed like a reasonable arrangement. The Queen could have the formal acknowledgement, the nominal authority, the shadow of sovereignty, but Maori would retain the substance, the actual control, the real authority, the tangible power over their lands and lives. But Nopera himself would later reverse this statement. Years after signing, having seen how British colonization actually proceeded, he bitterly observed that in fact the substance of the land had gone to the Queen, while only the shadow remained for Maori. What he thought he was agreeing to and what actually happened were two very different things. Some historians, including Paul Moon and Sabi Fenton, have argued that Henry Williams was fluent enough in Maori and skilled enough as a translator that he must have known he was creating different meanings in the two texts. Far from being a poor translator struggling with an impossible task, Williams may have deliberately crafted each version to be palatable to its intended audience, without either side fully grasping the contradictions. The English version gave the Crown what it needed, a clear statement of sovereignty. The Maori version gave the chiefs what they needed, assurance that their rangatiratanga would continue. When these two cultures tried to create a document that would govern their relationship, they ran up against the limits of translation itself. It wasn't just that certain words didn't translate, the entire conceptual framework didn't translate. The British came from a literate, hierarchical, centralized political system built on abstract concepts like sovereignty and property rights and legal jurisdiction. Maori came from an oral, decentralized, relationship-based political culture organized around mana, tapu, utu, and the complex web of obligations and authorities that connected chiefs to their people and to each other. So when those 530 or so Maori chiefs put their marks on the treaty in 1840, whether signatures or moko drawings or simple X marks, they were agreeing to something. But exactly what they were agreeing to, and what they thought they were agreeing to, and whether those two things were the same, would become the burning question at the heart of New Zealand's future. Were they ceding sovereignty, or just accepting a governor? Were they retaining full chieftainship, or just property ownership? Did they understand they were giving up their political independence, or did they think they were forming a partnership? For decades after 1840, there would be no argument at all, because for decades the Crown simply ignored the treaty entirely. And when Maori tried to assert the rights they believed they had been promised, they discovered that what they thought they had agreed to mattered very little when faced with settlers who wanted their land and a government willing to take it. Chapter 2. Coalition Government's Systematic Rollback of Maori Health Authority, Language Rights, and Cultural Policies. On October 14, 2023, New Zealand voters handed the Labour Party a crushing defeat. Jacinda Ardern had already resigned as Prime Minister earlier that year, handing leadership to Chris Hipkins, but even his attempts to refocus on cost of living issues couldn't save Labour from losing 31 seats. The National Party, led by Christopher Luxon, won just over 38% of the vote. It wasn't enough to govern alone. Luxon found himself in the position of needing coalition partners to form a government. Two smaller parties held the keys to power. David Seymour's Libertarian ACT Party had won less than 9% of the vote, but would extract an outsized price for its support. Winston Peters and his populist New Zealand First Party had clawed back over 6%, returning to Parliament after being absent the previous term. Both Seymour and Peters are themselves of Maori descent, but during the campaign, they had positioned themselves firmly against what they called race-based policies. The coalition negotiations took over a month. When the agreement was finally announced in late November, Maori leaders immediately understood something had shifted fundamentally in New Zealand politics. The deal gave both Seymour and Peters the title of Deputy Prime Minister to be held on a rotating basis. More importantly, it gave them influence over policy direction far beyond what their vote shares would normally command. Within the coalition agreement were commitments that would reshape the Crown's relationship with Maori in ways not seen in decades. The speed of what followed shocked even seasoned political observers. Richard Shaw, a professor of politics at Massey University, would later describe Luxon's government as the most explicitly anti-Maori government he could remember. This is the first government that I can recall which has quite explicitly said, "We'll have less of that," not "we'll have more of it," Shaw said. So this really is an awkward, unsettled moment. By early December, barely 2 weeks after the government was sworn in, Te Pāti Maori called for a National Maori Action Day. On December 5th, thousands of Maori protesters took to streets across New Zealand, blocking traffic on key roads in Auckland, marching on Parliament in Wellington, and staging demonstrations in dozens of smaller towns. The protests marked the opening day of New Zealand's 54th Parliament. They also marked the beginning of what would become an ongoing confrontation between Maori and the coalition government over not just individual policies, but the entire framework of indigenous rights that had been built up over 50 years. The Maori Health Authority was among the first casualties. Te Aka Waiora had been established in 2022 under Jacinda Ardern's Labour government with a specific mandate: improve the health outcomes of Indigenous people. The statistics that justified its creation were stark. Maori life expectancy was 7 years less than the general population. Maori faced higher rates of virtually every major health condition. 63% of women in prison were Maori. The health gaps between Maori and non-Maori had persisted for generations despite various attempts to address them. The authority had been designed based on the principle of by Maori, for Maori, the idea that Maori communities themselves were best positioned to understand and address their own health needs. It operated somewhat independently within the health system, with increased funding directed to Maori health providers and initiatives. It represented a structural commitment to addressing systemic disparities through dedicated institutional support. Luxon's government announced it would disband the authority entirely. The justification was that the government would achieve better Maori health outcomes by reducing what it called red tape and focusing on need rather than ethnicity. "We are determined that Maori are going to do better under our government than they have in the last 6 years," Luxon told reporters. The claim was that rather than having separate systems, integrating health services would serve everyone better. Hope Tupara, president of the Maori Women's Welfare League, was unconvinced. "They are not things that are dreamed up in 5 minutes," she said of the targeted Maori health initiatives. "They are established because of evidence over time. We saw the Ardern administration increasing the amount of government investment into Maori health solutions by Maori providers on the basis of by Maori for Maori. We have an expectation of the kinds of public services that are available to us as part of the population, which I think is reasonable." The dissolution of the health authority sent a clear signal, but it was far from the only change. The government simultaneously announced what it called an English-first approach to official communications and the naming of government departments. Throughout the previous 6 years under Labour, there had been a steady shift toward incorporating Te Reo Māori more prominently in public life. Government departments had adopted Maori names alongside or sometimes instead of English ones. Official communications routinely included Maori phrases. Ministers often began speeches with greetings in Te Reo. Signs and documents increasingly appeared in both languages. The coalition partners, particularly New Zealand First, had long opposed what they saw as forced Maorification. The party platform had specifically criticized the use of Maori names for government departments and the practice of referring to New Zealand as Aotearoa in official contexts. Now in power, they moved quickly to reverse these trends. Government departments began reverting to English-only names. The widespread practice of opening with Maori greetings was quietly discouraged. New Zealand First leader Winston Peters had previously described bilingual road signs and the use of Aotearoa as examples of virtue signaling and politically correct extremism. The new policy direction reflected those views. For many Maori, particularly younger generations who had grown up during the language revival of recent decades, these changes felt like erasure. Te Reo Māori had been experiencing what scholars called a renaissance. After generations of decline, accelerated by policies like the Native Schools Act of 1867 that actively discouraged speaking Maori, the language had been making a comeback. Kohanga Rio, Maori language preschools, had been established in 1982 and had played a crucial role in creating a new generation of fluent speakers. Maori language television channels had been launched. Everyday words like piaora had entered common usage even among non-Maori New Zealanders. The normalization of te reo in public spaces had been hard-won over decades of advocacy. The government's shift away from Maori language in official contexts threatened to reverse this progress. It sent a message about whose language, and by extension whose culture, belonged in the public sphere and whose did not. Then came the smoking ban reversal, which hit Maori communities particularly hard. The previous Labour government had enacted what was described as world-leading anti-smoking legislation. The law would have prohibited the sale of cigarettes to anyone born after 2008, effectively creating a smoke-free generation. Public health experts internationally had praised it as an innovative approach to ending tobacco addiction. The statistics made clear why this mattered for Maori. About 20% of Maori adults smoke compared to an 8% national average. Lung cancer and other smoking-related diseases disproportionately affect Maori. The targeted legislation had been seen as a crucial tool for addressing this health gap. Luxon's government scrapped the ban entirely. The official justification was that the revenue from tobacco taxes was needed to fund promised income tax cuts. The move was criticized by health experts as prioritizing short-term revenue over long-term public health. Organizations like Hāpai Te Hauora, a national Maori health organization, called it an unconscionable blow to the health and well-being of all New Zealanders, but particularly devastating for Maori communities, where smoking rates remain stubbornly high. The reversal of the smoking ban, coming on top of the health authority's dissolution, suggested a government willing to undo health policies specifically designed to help Maori, even when those policies had been internationally recognized as innovative. Critics argued this demonstrated the coalition's disregard for Maori well-being in favor of other priorities. In early August 2024, the Ngāpuhi Iwai organized a protest outside Parliament. They had traveled from Northland to Wellington to oppose another proposed change, the repeal of Section 7AA of the Oranga Tamariki Act. The amendment, known simply as 7AA, was designed to address a painful reality. Maori children were dramatically overrepresented in state care. More than 800 Ngāpuhi children alone were in the system, more than any other Maori tribe in the country. Section 7AA required the Ministry for Children to take specific steps to keep Māori children connected to their wana, their culture, and their tribal identity when they entered state care. The provision recognized that removing children from their families and communities had historically been a tool of cultural assimilation. The amendment was meant to prevent a repeat of past practices that had severed Māori children from their heritage. Mane Tahere, chair of Ngāpuhi, had initially walked out of a meeting with the Prime Minister over the issue. By the following Monday, he had organized the protest. "We are in crisis as a tribe," Tahere told the crowd gathered at Parliament. "It's hugely important. What we're talking about are the next 3 to 5 generations. We have to stand up." The government argued that 7AA had led the department to focus more on a child's cultural needs than on their immediate safety and well-being. Tama Potaka, the Minister for Maori Development, said the repeal was simply about ensuring the safety and well-being comes first. But for Ngāpuhi protesters, the choice was false. Safety and cultural connection were not opposed values. A Maori child cut off from their culture and family was not truly safe, no matter how physically secure their placement might be. Outside Parliament, Tahere delivered a warning. "Our people are backed into a corner. Our people are sick of attack after attack on Ngāpuhi, Iwa, Maori. If you don't stop, we'll make you stop." The protests over 7AA had particular resonance because of New Zealand's history. Between 1950 and 2019, about 200,000 children, young people, and vulnerable adults had been subjected to physical and sexual abuse in state and church care. A Royal Commission of Inquiry had investigated and issued its findings in July 2024. The commission found that Maori children were more vulnerable to abuse than others, often facing racist treatment and disconnection from their culture while in care. On November 12, 2024, Prime Minister Luxon issued a formal apology to survivors of abuse in state care. The apology was criticized by Maori survivors as inadequate, particularly because it did not reference the Treaty of Waitangi. Critics pointed out the bitter irony. The government apologized for past mistreatment of Maori children in care while simultaneously moving to repeal the very provision designed to prevent future cultural harm to Maori children in the same system. But individual policy changes, as significant as they were, didn't capture the full scope of what was happening. The coalition was also moving against the broader concept of co-governance, the idea that Maori should have formal partnership roles in decision-making about natural resources and public services. This concept had developed over decades as one interpretation of what the treaty's guarantee of rangataratanga might mean in practice. Various arrangements had been established where Maori representatives had seats at the table alongside Crown representatives in managing everything from water resources to conservation lands. ACT and New Zealand First had campaigned explicitly against co-governance, arguing it created a two-tier system where some New Zealanders had more rights than others based on ancestry. The coalition agreement included commitments to review and roll back co-governance arrangements. Government departments were instructed that they should no longer target policies specifically to redress Maori inequities. The message was clear. The era of Maori-specific programs and Maori partnership in governance was ending. Winston Peters went so far as to compare co-governance to Nazi Germany in March 2024, arguing that partnership arrangements based on ethnicity echoed the racial categorization of Nazi ideology. The comparison was widely condemned as offensive and historically absurd. Ben Kepps, a spokesperson for the Holocaust Centre of New Zealand, called the remarks inappropriate. But Peters' willingness to make such an extreme comparison indicated how far the political discourse had shifted. By mid-2024, the cumulative effect of all these changes was becoming clear. Hope Tupara of the Maori Women's Welfare League reflected on what she was witnessing. The level of opposition to what we have achieved for ourselves is something that I haven't seen in my lifetime. It wasn't just the specific policies. It was the speed, the scope, and the message they sent collectively. The health authority, the language, the smoking ban, the children in care, the co-governance rollbacks. Each individual change could potentially be defended on its own terms, as the government attempted to do. But together they formed a pattern. The pattern suggested a government fundamentally opposed to the framework of Maori-specific rights and protections that had been built up since the 1970s. Debbie Ngarewa Packer, co-leader of Te Pāti Māori, articulated what many Maori were feeling. Your attacks on our culture have motivated our standing in solidarity. But she also recognized the deeper challenge. In a later interview, she would say, "We actually have to fight and do all of this for nothing," referring to the political reality that most of these battles seemed predetermined to fail. The coalition had the votes. The policies would pass. And yet the fight continued because what was at stake was not just immediate policy outcomes, but the long-term relationship between Maori and the Crown. Early in 2024, something extraordinary happened that illustrated how seriously Maori leaders were taking the threat. The Maori king, Kingi Tuhetia Putatau Te Werowero VII, issued a royal proclamation calling for a national hui, a gathering of iwai from across the country. Such gatherings are rare, reserved for moments of genuine crisis. The last comparable hui had been held in 2006 at the tangi of the previous Maori queen. The hui was scheduled for January 20, 2024, at Tarango Aweye Marae in Garuahia. Organizers expected about 3,000 people. Instead, more than 10,000 showed up. They came from across the North Island and the South Island, traveling by bus, car, horseback. The marae had to set up marquees to accommodate the overflow. Thousands of packed lunches were distributed. Children played in the Waikato River to escape the summer heat. Inside, speeches and discussions continued for hours. The message of the hui was both defensive and aspirational. Defensive in the sense that Māori were gathering to resist what they saw as attacks on their rights and culture. Aspirational in the sense that they were also articulating a positive vision of what the treaty relationship should look like. Kingi Tuhitia addressed the crowd late in the day. "By turning up, we've sent a strong message, and that's the message that has been heard around the world," he said. He called for the treaty to be entrenched in constitutional law to prevent future governments from unilaterally reinterpreting it. He urged Māori to understand the treaty through their own reo and tikanga rather than through Pākehā interpretations. But perhaps most memorably, the king offered a different vision of protest. "The best protest we can do right now is be Māori, be who we are, live our values, speak our reo, care for our mokopuna, our awa, our maunga, just be Māori. Māori all day, every day. We are here, we are strong." It was a call to cultural resilience in the face of political opposition. If the government was going to roll back Māori programs and minimize Māori language in official spaces, then Māori would respond by doubling down on their cultural practices in their own communities. They would speak te reo regardless of whether the government did. They would practice tikanga regardless of whether policies supported it. They would assert their identity not through policy victories, but through daily lived practice. The hui demonstrated something the coalition government had perhaps not fully anticipated. That its policy changes were not just angering Maori activists or political opponents, but were unifying Maori across tribal lines in ways that hadn't been seen in years. The 10,000 people who showed up at Turangawaiwai represented dozens of different IWI, different political perspectives, different generations. What unified them was the sense that something fundamental was under threat. Christopher Finlayson, who had served as Attorney General and Minister for Treaty Negotiations under previous national governments, watched these developments with dismay. He had spent years working on treaty settlements, negotiating agreements between the Crown and IWI to address historical grievances. He believed in the treaty as a framework for the relationship between Maori and the Crown, and he thought his own party was making a terrible mistake. This is a bill that is divisive, going nowhere, and should really have been killed stone dead some months ago, Finlayson said of the Treaty Principles Bill that would come later. But his criticism extended to the broader policy direction. I would have simply said, David, you're not going to have this legislation. And if he'd had a tantrum and said, oh, I'll sit on the crossbenches, well, I know what John Key would have done. He would have said, go and sit on the crossbenches. I'll personally stand against you at the next election, and I'll destroy you.
Finlayson represented an older National Party tradition. Conservative, certainly, but committed to honoring the treaty and working with Maori within the existing framework. The new National Party, under pressure from ACT and New Zealand First, had abandoned that approach in favor of coalition stability. The question Maori leaders were increasingly asking was whether this was a temporary political moment that would pass, or whether it represented a fundamental realignment of New Zealand politics. Was this just one election cycle, or was it the beginning of a longer-term rollback of Maori rights? And if the latter, what would be required to resist it?
Chapter 3. The Principles Bill. The timing itself felt like a provocation. The Treaty Principles Bill had been scheduled for introduction to Parliament on November 18, 2024. That date mattered because a massive protest march, a Hīkoi, was planned to arrive at Parliament on November 19th. The march had been organized specifically to oppose the bill, and thousands were already making their way down the length of New Zealand toward Wellington. But on November 7th, with little warning, David Seymour suddenly introduced the bill 11 days early. When the news broke, a Waitangi Tribunal internal memo was leaked to media showing that officials had been caught off guard by the schedule change. Seymour's office claimed the earlier introduction was simply normal process, dependent on cabinet approval, which had come through that week. But to Maori leaders, the move felt calculated. It appeared designed to present Parliament with a fait accompli before the Hīkoi could arrive and demonstrate the scale of opposition. Rawiri Waititi and Debbie Narewa Packer, the co-leaders of Te Pāti Maori, addressed supporters through a live stream that night. This is not accidental, Narewa Packer said. They are fearful that you are coming. The Hīkoi organizers, led by Eru Kapakingi, responded defiantly. We always knew a shuffle like this would come along. This is not unexpected from this coalition. Bills come and go, but the treaty is infinite, and so are we. Our plans will not change. To understand why this bill provoked such fury, you need to understand what it was replacing. For 50 years, New Zealand's courts, the Waitangi Tribunal, and successive governments had been developing principles to guide how the treaty should be interpreted in contemporary policy and law. These principles were not written into the original 1840 treaty. They had evolved through tribunal decisions, court rulings, and negotiated settlements. They represented a hard-won consensus built case by case about what the treaty's promises meant in practice. The principles were generally described as partnership, protection, and participation, though different formulations existed and the exact wording varied. Partnership meant the Crown and Maori should work together as the treaty's two parties in matters affecting Maori interests. Protection meant the Crown had an obligation to actively protect Maori rights, language, culture, and resources. Participation meant Maori should be involved in decisions that affect them. These principles were intentionally flexible, able to be applied to new situations as they arose. This flexibility was the point. The original treaty texts, with all their translation problems and ambiguities, couldn't provide detailed guidance for modern questions about environmental policy, or healthcare delivery, or broadcasting rights. The principles provided a framework for working out what the treaty's spirit required in cases the 1840 signatories could never have imagined. David Seymour argued this entire approach was wrong. The principles, he said, had never been properly defined in law. They had been developed by courts and tribunals in what he called backrooms without democratic input. This had created a vacuum that allowed the principles to be stretched beyond anything the treaty's signatories intended. The result, in his view, was a two-tier system where Maori had different rights from other New Zealanders based solely on ancestry. His bill proposed to replace all existing principles with 3 new ones, defined clearly and applied to all New Zealanders equally. The proposed principles were: Article 1. The New Zealand government has the right to govern all New Zealanders. Everyone, regardless of ancestry, should be treated equally under the law. Article 2. The New Zealand government will honour all New Zealanders in the chieftainship of their land and all their property. The rights that Maori had when signing the treaty would be respected, but only if those rights differ from others' rights in ways that were agreed in historical treaty settlements. Article 3. All New Zealanders are equal under the law with the same rights and duties. On paper, this could sound reasonable, even appealing, to someone who didn't understand the history. Equal rights for everyone, the same legal protections regardless of ethnicity. Who could oppose equality? But Maori leaders and legal experts saw something very different in these words. They saw an attempt to reduce the treaty from a living constitutional document establishing an ongoing relationship between two peoples into a simple historical property agreement that had been essentially completed. They saw an attempt to erase the concept of Maori as a treaty partner with ongoing rights to self-determination, replacing it with Maori as just another ethnic group whose only special status came from court settlements about past grievances. The leaked Justice Ministry document made this concern explicit. The government's own lawyers stated bluntly, "The bill will also change the nature of the principles from reflecting a relationship akin to a partnership between the Crown and Maori to reflecting the relationship the Crown has with all citizens of New Zealand. This is not supported by either the spirit of the treaty or the text of the treaty." When this document leaked on the eve of the bill's introduction, it ignited fury. Here were the government's own lawyers saying the bill contradicted the treaty itself. The memo went further, analyzing each proposed principle and finding them at odds with established law and treaty interpretation. It suggested the bill would overturn decades of settled legal understanding and potentially invalidate numerous existing laws that reference treaty principles. Seymour dismissed the leaked memo as just one opinion among many. He argued that officials were defending their own institutional interests in maintaining the existing system. The whole point of the bill, he said, was to challenge the status quo that those officials represented.
Then came the Waitangi Tribunal's response. The tribunal had been established in 1975 specifically to investigate treaty breaches. It had no power to overrule Parliament or strike down laws, but its moral and historical authority was significant. On Tuesday, November 12th, the tribunal released a preliminary report on the Treaty Principles Bill. The language was stark, particularly for a usually measured government body. If this bill were to be enacted, it would be the worst, most comprehensive breach of the treaty in modern times. If the bill remained on the statute book for a considerable time or was never repealed, it could mean the end of the treaty. The tribunal's report methodically dismantled each of Seymour's proposed principles. It found them based on flawed policy rationales and novel in their interpretations. The existing principles, the tribunal noted, had been developed over 50 years through careful consideration of the treaty's texts, its historical context, and the relationship it established. Seymour's principles, by contrast, appeared designed to achieve a predetermined political outcome, ending what he called special treatment for Maori, rather than to faithfully interpret what the treaty partners had agreed to. Over 40 of New Zealand's most senior lawyers, including numerous King's Counsel and former judges, signed an open letter opposing the bill. They argued that treaty principles didn't need to be defined in statute because they were already well established through extensive legal precedent. Attempting to redefine them through legislation risked creating constitutional chaos, potentially invalidating existing laws and undermining settled legal expectations.
The lawyer's letter pointed out something crucial. The treaty principles weren't vague or uncertain in legal terms. Yes, they were flexible and adaptable to new situations, but that was how constitutional principles work. The principles had been extensively discussed and refined through hundreds of cases and decisions. There was a robust body of legal understanding about what they meant and how they applied. Seymour's claim that clarity was needed was, in their view, simply wrong. Former Prime Minister Jenny Shipley, a conservative who had led a national government in the 1990s, went further. She declared that the bill was inviting civil war. It was hyperbolic language from someone not known for overstatement. But her point was that the bill threatened to rupture the social compact that had been painstakingly built since the 1970s. Shipley understood that treaty settlements and the principles framework had allowed New Zealand to address historical injustices and reduce racial tensions. Tearing up that framework would, she feared, unleash conflicts that had been slowly healing. But opposition from lawyers and former leaders didn't stop the bill from proceeding. The coalition agreement required National and New Zealand First to support it through the first reading and select committee stage. Both parties had made clear they would vote it down at the second reading, meaning it had no realistic path to becoming law. But the process would continue nonetheless.
Thursday, November 14th, was the scheduled first reading. Parliament was tense that morning. Te Pāti Māori had signalled they would not let the bill proceed without protest, though what form that protest would take wasn't clear. Outside Parliament, about 100 students from various Wellington schools had gathered in opposition, holding signs reading, "Kill the Bill." The debate inside was fierce. Willie Jackson, a Labour MP and veteran Māori advocate, called it a right-wing obscenity masquerading as equality, and was thrown out of the debating chamber by Speaker Jerry Brownlee for calling Seymour a liar. Chris Hipkins, the Labour leader and former Prime Minister, said the debate would be a stain on the country. He called it a grubby little deal, referring to the coalition negotiations that had brought it into existence. National MPs gave awkward speeches explaining that while they personally opposed the bill and thought it was misguided, they would vote for it anyway to honour the coalition agreement. They emphasised this would be the only time they'd support it. The speeches had a defensive, uncomfortable quality. These were not politicians proud of what they were doing. Prime Minister Luxon left the country for the meeting of leaders from the Asia-Pacific APEC bloc hours before the vote, a departure that spoke volumes about his discomfort with the situation.
David Seymour defended his bill passionately. He argued that the existing principles had created ethnic quotas in public institutions and different levels of citizenship based on ancestry. What all of these principles have in common is that they afford Maori different rights from other New Zealanders, he said. The bill, he insisted, simply established that everyone should have the same fundamental human rights regardless of their ancestry. The challenge for opponents, he said, was to explain why they opposed that basic principle of equality. When the vote was called, proceedings were disrupted by a powerful haka from Te Pāti Māori MPs. The bill passed its first reading with 65 votes in favor and 55 against.
National, ACT, and New Zealand First had provided the majority. Now the bill would proceed to a select committee, which would spend 6 months hearing public submissions. Already the process was breaking records. Over 300,000 submissions would eventually be received, the largest response to any proposed legislation in New Zealand's parliamentary history. About 90% of those submissions opposed the bill. But the Select Committee hearing would happen regardless. Public meetings would be held. Seymour would get his national conversation about the treaty, whether New Zealand wanted it or not. The question many were asking was, why? Why force this divisive process when the bill had no chance of passing? What was the point of 6 months of public hearings and submissions and debates when National and New Zealand First had already promised to kill it at the second reading? Some saw it as Seymour building his political brand. He was positioning himself as the defender of equal rights against what he called racial privilege. He was mobilizing a constituency. An October 2024 poll found 45% of New Zealanders supported the bill, with 25% opposed and 29% unsure. Even if the bill died, Seymour could claim he'd been right but been blocked by cowardly coalition partners who wouldn't stand up for equality. Others saw a more sinister long-term strategy. The 6 months of submissions and debate would normalize the idea that treaty principles should be questioned. It would give space for arguments against Maori rights to be aired and validated. Even if this bill failed, it would shift the political center of gravity, making future challenges to treaty recognition more acceptable. And there was always the possibility, however remote, that the politics might shift during the process. If public opinion swung decisively in favor, National might be tempted to continue supporting it despite their current promises. Carwyn Jones, a Maori law expert at Te Wānanga o Raukawa, articulated the harm this was already causing. It is increasing misinformation about the treaty. It is already having an impact on the relationship between Maori and the Crown and on social cohesion. It is having a real impact on many Maori in terms of feeling under attack. For lots of younger Maori, this is a really distressing situation.
The contradiction at the heart of the government's position was glaring. They claimed the bill was necessary for clarity and democracy, but they also admitted it was simplistic and divisive and would never become law. They were enabling a process they claimed to oppose, inflaming tensions they claimed to want to heal, all in service of a coalition agreement that had put them in power. Meanwhile, David Seymour was unrepentant. He saw himself not as defeated, but as ahead of his time. The arguments would continue. The pressure would build. Eventually, he believed, New Zealand would come around to his view that the treaty should guarantee equal rights rather than partnership. But what his analysis missed was what those who opposed his bill understood instinctively. The question was never really about legal principles or constitutional clarity. It was about whether New Zealand would continue to recognize Maori as the treaty's partner, or would reduce them to just another demographic in a multicultural society. It was about whether Rangatiratanga still meant anything, or whether it had been finally extinguished by weight of numbers and time and political convenience. It was about whether a document signed in 1840 still bound the Crown to promises made, or whether each new government could simply reinterpret those promises to suit current political winds. And the Hīkoi was still coming. Chapter 4. Hīkoi and Haka. The Hīkoi began in 2 places at once, at the opposite ends of New Zealand. In the far north, marchers gathered at Te Rarenga Wairua, Cape Ranga, where Maori tradition says the spirits of the dead depart for the homeland of Hawaii. In the deep south, another group assembled at Bluff, the southernmost point of the South Island. Both would walk toward Wellington, picking up supporters in every town they passed through, converging on Parliament after 9 days of travel. This was no spontaneous demonstration. Hīkoi are part of Maori tradition, long walks undertaken to protest injustice or assert rights. The most famous was the 1975 Land March led by Weena Cooper, when about 5,000 people walked from the north to Wellington to protest ongoing land loss.
That march had been a turning point, leading to the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal. Organizers of the 2024 Hīkoi hoped for something similar, not just to stop one bill, but to reassert the treaty's centrality to New Zealand's identity. The Northern March left Cape Reinga on November 10, 2024. It was a Sunday, and those who gathered for the Dawn Karakia knew they were beginning something significant. Iru Kapakinji, a relatively unknown activist who had emerged as the Hīkoi's primary organizer, spoke to the group about why they were walking. "We are here because they will not listen," he said. "Why would we speak to ears that would not listen? Why would we speak to minds that would not change? Why would we speak to a power structure that never should have happened?"
The first day covered the journey through Northland, stopping in small communities where local IWI had prepared food and places to rest. The convoy was not just walkers. Many drove in cars and buses decorated with Tino Rangatiratanga flags, the red, white and black Maori sovereignty flag that had become the symbol of the movement. Children waved from the roadside. Elders came out of their homes to watch the procession pass. By the time the Hīkoi reached Kaitaia late on the first day, hundreds had joined. The next morning it moved through Whangarei, where over 1,000 people were waiting in Laurie Hill Park. The crowd was jubilant. Ngāti IWI provided food for everyone. People wore T-shirts reading Toiatu Te Tiriti, Honour the Treaty. Kapakingi spoke again in Whangarei. His message was getting sharper as the Hīkoi grew. He challenged the legitimacy of Parliament itself to rewrite the treaty. Why would we go to Parliament to debate our existence with people who have no right to debate it? The treaty is between Maori chiefs and the Crown. Parliament has no authority to change what our ancestors agreed to. On Wednesday, November 13th, the Northern Hīkoi reached Auckland, New Zealand's largest city. This was the crucial test. The march was scheduled to cross the Auckland Harbour Bridge at 9 a.m. during morning rush hour. Authorities had reluctantly agreed, closing 2 lanes to accommodate what they thought might be a few hundred marchers.
Instead, an estimated 5,000 people showed up at Wanapoto Domain in Northcote on the North Shore. The bridge crossing took 2 hours. The Herald reported something remarkable. The massive steel structure swayed with the rhythm of the marchers' footsteps and the cadence of their chants. Kia kaha, kia maya, kia mana wanui. Be strong, be brave, be steadfast. The bridge had never felt anything like it. Danielle Moreau walked across with her 2 sons, Bobby and Teddy. She told reporters afterwards that she had hoped the turnout would be big, but this was much more epic than I expected. I marched to make the point that Te Tiriti is very important to our national identity. Winston Pond, walking beside her, said, "We are a multicultural society built on a bicultural base, something that cannot be altered." What was striking about the Auckland turnout was its diversity. Yes, there were Maori in traditional dress with moko on their faces and kakahu, woven cloaks across their shoulders. But there were also Pākehā families, Asian immigrants holding signs in multiple languages, Pacific Islander church groups, and teenagers who had skipped school. The movement was not just Maori asserting their rights against everyone else. It was a broader coalition defending the treaty as the foundation of an inclusive, bicultural nation.
After crossing the bridge, the Hīkoi stopped at Bestian Point, a site of profound historical significance. In 1977-78, Ngāti Whaktua had occupied the point for 506 days to protest the government's plan to develop land that had been taken from them. Police and army had eventually removed the protesters by force. But years later, the Waitangi Tribunal had ruled in Ngāti Watua's favour, and Bestian Point was returned to them. It was a reminder that resistance sometimes took decades to bear fruit, but could ultimately succeed. But not everyone marching through Auckland that day was in solidarity with the Hīkoi. On Saturday, November 16th, Destiny church leader Brian Tamaki organised what he called a Make New Zealand Great Again rally. About 100 motorcycles roared through Auckland streets, deliberately opposing the Hīkoi. They blocked the motorway, carrying New Zealand flags in opposition to what Tamaki called divisive Maori sovereignty flags.
The counter-protest showed that the division wasn't simply government versus Maori. There were splits within Maori and Pākehā communities themselves about what the treaty meant and what role it should play in modern New Zealand. The Hīkoi continued south. On November 14th, it reached Hamilton, the largest city in the Waikato region and the heart of the Kingitanga, the Maori King movement. More than 6,000 marched down Victoria Street to Garden Place. That same day, back in Wellington, Parliament was holding the first reading of the Treaty Principles Bill. The timing was no accident. The Hīkoi was still days away from the capital, but already its presence was being felt. Inside the debating chamber, the atmosphere was tense.
When the vote was called, Hanarawihiti Maipi Clark of Te Pati Māori stood and began a ringing haka. At 22, she was the youngest MP in Parliament, and she was about to create one of the most memorable moments in New Zealand's political history. As her voice rose in the traditional challenge, other Te Pati Māori MPs joined her, then members of the public gallery. The sound built, voices layering over voices, feet stamping, hands slapping chests in the powerful rhythm of kamate. Speaker Jerry Brownlee called repeatedly for order, his voice drowned out by the performance. An irate Brownlee was unable to quiet the fracas as opponents approached Seymour's seat, their haka directed squarely at the man who had authored the bill. Te Pati Māori MP Rawiri Waititi stood in the aisle, leading the call and response. The chamber had never witnessed anything like it. The live broadcast of Parliament's proceedings was cut. Television viewers across New Zealand saw their screens go black, hearing only the muffled sound of the continuing haka. Brownlee ordered the public gallery cleared. Security staff moved to escort people out, but the performance continued until it reached its natural conclusion. Only then did Maipi Clark return to her seat. Brownlee suspended her from Parliament for a day. But the video of her performance was already spreading across social media, viewed millions of times within hours. In Hamilton, where 6,000 marchers had gathered, news of the haka arrived to roaring approval. Maipi Clark received a hero's welcome when she joined the crowd that evening, people celebrating her courage, treating her not as a troublemaker who had disrupted Parliament, but as a warrior who had stood up for her people.
That same day, a separate Hīkoi on the east coast was making its way from Potaka down State Highway 35 toward Gisborne. About 3,000 people turned out in Gisborne, marching across the Gladstone Road Bridge and along London Street to Te Poho Orawiri Marae. Derek Lardelli, a respected cultural advisor, and former MP Meka Waitiri walked at the front. By November 15th, the Hīkoi reached Rotorua, one of the cultural centers of Maori life in New Zealand. Despite heavy rain, 10,000 people turned out. The city's streets were packed. Tame Iti, the legendary activist who had spent years fighting for Tūhou sovereignty, joined the march. At 71 years old, Iti was a living connection to earlier generations of Maori protest. His presence linked the Hīkoi to the radical activism of the 1970s and 80s, while the young people surrounding him represented a new generation carrying the struggle forward. Te Pati Māori co-leader Rawiri Waititi gave a speech in Rotorua that crystallized what many were feeling. "This is not just about one bill," he said. "This is about whether we will accept being erased, whether we will accept our children growing up without knowing who they are, whether we will accept our language dying, our culture being treated as museum pieces instead of living practice. Every person here is saying, no, not today, not ever." The southern Hīkoi, meanwhile, had been making its own journey. Starting from Bluff on November 12th, it travelled through Invercargill, where hundreds joined. Then up through Dunedin, where about 1,000 people filled the Octagon, the city's central plaza. On November 13th, around 2,000 protesters gathered at Christchurch's Bridge of Remembrance. Takuta Ferris, the Te Pati Māori MP for Te Tai Tonga, led the southern contingent. The South Island march was smaller than the northern one, but it demonstrated that opposition to the bill spanned the entire country. In Nelson, more than 2,000 marched around 1903 Square and down Trafalgar Street. Even in tiny Takaka, over 100 people turned out.
These were not cities with large Maori populations. These were demonstrations of solidarity from Pākehā New Zealanders, who saw the treaty as important to national identity regardless of their own ancestry. Alice Soper, a non-Maori protester in Wellington, would later say the government has traded its relationship to Maori in order to get access to power. The various streams of the Hīkoi were converging on Wellington. By Monday, November 18th, organisers were predicting the final march on Parliament could draw 50,000 people. Police were planning for that possibility. The city's rail network prepared for unprecedented demand. Marae in Wellington and surrounding cities organised to host hundreds of visitors arriving from out of town. Waitangi Park, near the waterfront, was designated as the gathering point for the final march. Inside Parliament, Prime Minister Luxon was trying to manage the optics. He had initially said he was willing to meet with Hīkoi organisers, but then backed away, dismissing them as Te Pāti Maori affiliated, as if that invalidated their concerns. He would not be attending the protest. David Seymour, by contrast, said he thought it was important to acknowledge the marchers' right to be heard. Winston Peters was more dismissive. He called the Hīkoi a Maori party astroturf, meaning an artificially created grassroots movement, and said it was pointless because the bill was dead on arrival anyway. But Peters' contempt for the protest only seemed to energize it. Even institutions that were supposed to remain neutral were being drawn into the conflict. Police Minister Mark Mitchell had to address media reports that some police officers had been helping paint Hīkoi signs. The controversy showed how deep the divisions ran. Even within the police force, there were those who sympathized with the marchers. Tuesday morning, November 19th, arrived with Wellington's typically unreliable weather showing mercy. The day was clear and mild. By 9 a.m., Waitangi Park was packed. Thousands had arrived early, some having traveled overnight. About 2,000 walked from Petone along State Highway 2. Another group came from Porirua. The park became a sea of red, white, and black flags. Families had brought children. Elders sat in wheelchairs pushed by grandchildren. University students mixed with trade unionists. Church groups stood alongside activist collectives.
Thomas Nash, Wellington's transport chair, would later report that the city's rail network had possibly its busiest morning ever, with 40,000 people passing through Wellington railway station. The entire public transport system was strained to its limits. At the front of the gathering was Ngā Wai Hono i Te Pō, the Maori Queen. She had ascended to the position only months earlier after the death of her father, Kingi Tuhitia. She was 27 years old, and this was one of her first major public acts as monarch. Her spokesperson, Ngera Simmons, had made clear what her presence meant. The Maori Queen is willing to help lead a conversation about nationhood and national unity, but she will not accept a unilateral process that undermines the treaty. Wellington Mayor Tori Wana was also there, walking with the protesters. Having a city mayor join was significant. This was not just Maori versus the government. This was a cross-section of society rejecting what the government was trying to do. The march began around 10 a.m. The route went from Waitangi Park up through the city centre toward Parliament, about 2 kilometres away. But the crowd was so large that when the front reached Parliament, the back was still leaving Waitangi Park. Police estimated that 42,000 people participated in Wellington alone, not counting the additional tens of thousands who had joined the Hīkoi at various points along its 9-day journey. Some estimates put the total participants across the country at over 80,000.
If the police estimate was accurate, this was the largest political demonstration in New Zealand history. It dwarfed the 5,000 who had marched in 1975. It was double the size of the 15,000 who had protested the 2004 Foreshore and Seabed Act. It rivaled the massive anti-apartheid protests during the 1981 Springbok rugby tour. Joel McManus of the spin-off, a political commentator, wrote, "This was possibly the largest protest Wellington had ever seen, and possibly the largest in New Zealand's history. The atmosphere outside Parliament was extraordinary. This was not an angry mob, it was closer to a festival. Stan Walker, the pop star, was there singing. Che Fu performed. Fireworks went off several times. People were dancing. Children played. Elders sat and talked, some crying, overwhelmed by the moment. The sound was constant, singing, chanting, the rhythmic call and response of Waiata, Maori songs passed down through generations. Photographer Te Rawitiroa Bosch, documenting the day, called the government a three-headed taniwa and described the massive feeling of solidarity that permeated the crowd. On the forecourt of Parliament, speakers addressed the crowd. Helmut Modlik gave an impassioned speech about the treaty as a sacred covenant. But it was Eru Kapakingi, the Hīkoi's main organizer, who perhaps best captured what had been accomplished. "The Maori nation has been born today," he said, to roaring approval. "Every single one of you who joined this march today, I hope you realize what you have committed to today. You have committed to a future where we revert back to the reality of our rangatira," he shouted, looking directly at the Beehive, Parliament's executive building. "Te Tiriti is forever."
Te Pāti Māori co-leader Rawiri Waititi took the microphone. "Kia ora, my sovereign peoples. Aotearoa is our kingdom. We must protect it. We've got a message for this government. Kill the bill! Kill the bill!" The crowd took up the chant, 42,000 voices in unison. "Kill the bill! Kill the bill!" Then David Seymour made what would prove to be a serious miscalculation. He walked out of Parliament onto the forecourt, apparently to demonstrate that he wasn't afraid of the protesters and to show respect for their democratic right to be heard. But the moment the crowd saw him, the chanting shifted. Shame! 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 The booing was immediate and overwhelming. "Kill the bill! Kill the bill!" filled the air. He waved awkwardly, trying to smile, but his discomfort was obvious. He stood there for approximately 5 minutes before turning and walking back inside, his attempt at magnanimity comprehensively rejected by the largest political gathering in the nation's history. Later, Seymour would tell media that the Hīkoi was not representative of New Zealand because only a tiny fraction of the population had attended. But this missed the point entirely. The Hīkoi wasn't trying to prove it represented a majority. It was asserting that Maori, as the treaty partner, had a status and standing that couldn't be erased by weight of numbers. The size of the protest mattered not because it showed majority support, but because it demonstrated the depth of Maori commitment to defending the treaty.
Inside Parliament, even as the speeches continued outside, Prime Minister Luxon was defending his government's position. "Our position as the National Party is unchanged," he said. "We won't be supporting the bill beyond second reading, and therefore it won't become law." But his words rang hollow when he was saying them from inside a building surrounded by tens of thousands of people protesting a process his government had enabled. By late afternoon, the formal protest began to wind down. The crowd slowly dispersed, many heading to Waitangi Park for a concert that would run into the evening. There would be a final karakia, a prayer to close the Hīkoi properly. Families packed up their signs and flags, people hugged, exchanged contact information, promised to stay connected. The experience had forged bonds. But the Hīkoi had accomplished something that extended beyond stopping one bill. It had created a moment of collective identity that younger Maori especially had never experienced before. "There is a real strength and pride," said Hayley Komene, who had marched in Wellington. "There are people from lots of different backgrounds here for the same reason. It's beautiful." Te Rauparaha Arena was hosting a sports tournament nearby, and young Maori athletes took breaks to watch the Hīkoi pass. Many moved to tears seeing their culture and rights defended so powerfully. A protester named Creative Taro described hearing conversations between parents and children about why they were marching. "Those little conversations were the ones that were cool to hear," he said. A generation was learning, through participation, what it meant to stand up for their rights. The international dimension was also significant. About 300 people, including Indigenous Australians, had protested in Sydney.
In Honolulu, supporters gathered with Tino Rangatiratanga flags, ending their march at Iolani Palace, the former seat of Hawaiian monarchy. In London, hundreds protested outside the New Zealand High Commission in Haymarket. In New York's Times Square, demonstrators carried signs opposing the bill. Jason Momoa, the Hawaiian-born Hollywood actor, posted to his Instagram followers asking them to support the marchers, stating, "They are fighting for their rights, their culture, and their coming generations." The Hīkoi was being recognized internationally as part of a global indigenous rights movement. The Select Committee process would still happen. For 6 months, submissions would be heard, pro and con. Public hearings were held around the country. David Seymour got his national conversation. People argued in newspapers, on radio, in letters to editors, in community meetings. The debate that Seymour wanted took place. But something had shifted. The Hīkoi had demonstrated that there were limits to what Maori would tolerate. The bill might proceed through the committee stage as promised in the coalition agreement, but it did so under the shadow of the largest protest in the nation's history. And when the bill came back to Parliament for its second reading on April 10, 2025, the outcome was never in doubt.
The vote was 112 to 11 against. Only Act's 11 members voted in favour. Every other party, National, New Zealand First, Labour, Greens, Te Pāti Maori, voted to kill it. When the result was announced, MPs broke into song. They sang Te Aroha, a traditional Maori hymn that has become something of a national anthem at moments of unity. The singing was spontaneous, with politicians from both sides of the House joining in. On December 10, 2024, Speaker Brownlee referred Maipi Clark, along with Rawiri Waititi, Debbie Ngārawa-Packer, and Labour MP Penny Henare, to Parliament's Privileges Committee for their roles in disrupting proceedings during the haka. The referrals came weeks after the event itself, a bureaucratic afterthought to a moment that had already transformed New Zealand politics. The victory was partial and provisional. David Seymour vowed to continue fighting. "I believe this bill, or something like it, will pass one day because there are not good arguments against its contents." He had lost the legislative battle, but believed he was winning the longer political war. The Select Committee process had normalized previously fringe arguments about the treaty. The months of debate had legitimized the idea that Maori had special privileges that needed to be questioned. The broader government program of rolling back Maori-specific programs and policies continued regardless. The Maori Health Authority stayed abolished. Section 7AA for children in care was repealed. Co-governance arrangements were unwound. The English first approach remained in place. The Treaty Principles Bill had been stopped, but the agenda that produced it was still being implemented in other ways. What remained uncertain was whether this mobilization could be sustained, whether it could be translated into enduring political power rather than a single spectacular moment. The 42,000 who had gathered outside Parliament knew they had won this battle, but they also knew that Seymour was right about one thing. The arguments would continue, the pressure would build, and the fundamental question of what the treaty means in modern New Zealand was far from settled.
The shadow and the substance. In 1840, a Maori chief named Nopara believed the Queen would receive only the shadow of sovereignty while Maori retained the substance. Years later, he bitterly reversed his assessment. Today, that same tension persists. The Hīkoi defeated the Treaty Principles Bill, but the broader rollback of Maori rights continues. What's at stake isn't just policy. It's whether New Zealand will honor its founding document as a living partnership or reduce it to a historical artifact whose promises can be reinterpreted at will. The largest protest in New Zealand's history proved that Maori won't accept erasure quietly. But demonstrations alone don't change power structures. The question facing New Zealand is the same one that faced those chiefs in 1840. What did we actually agree to? And, more importantly, who gets to decide? Thank you for listening.